By 2030, the efficacy of the sanctions tool itself may well be rendered obsolete. Until that point, however, you remain an unwilling participant within an economic warfare system fundamentally designed over a century ago to compel civilian populations into submission through starvation. If this exposition has illuminated the true origins of the financial control system that profoundly shapes your existence, I urge you to subscribe immediately. The forthcoming video will delve into the practicalities of how a post-dollar world will actually function once sanctions lose their potency and the empire constructed upon economic warfare finally crumbles. The historical pattern from World War I is unequivocally clear. Economic warfare may secure tactical victories in conflicts, but it ultimately hollows out and destroys empires. Britain, in essence, won the battle but lost its vast empire. The United States is demonstrably charting an identical course, with a projected timeline for this transformation being as short as 5 to 10 years. The very blockade that led to the deaths of 800,000 Germans inadvertently forged the sanctions-based system that now dictates the terms of your life. And that very system, by its own aggressive application, is now in the process of self-destruction. Welcome to the grim reality of economic warfare. You are not merely observing it. You are living inescapably within the weapon itself. This isn't a conflict you can merely observe from a distance, for its intricate mechanisms are now deeply embedded within the very fabric of your daily life. Every financial transaction, every subtle shift in global policy, now reverberates through this intricately constructed economic weapon, and you are not just a spectator, but an intrinsic, often unwilling, component of its formidable operation. Let us conclude by confronting a brutal, uncomfortable truth. In November 1918, Britain secured victory in World War I not solely through military might, but by deliberately starving an estimated 800,000 Germans to death through a relentless naval blockade and stringent financial isolation. This was not an unintended side effect, it was a calculated strategy, and it proved chillingly effective. Germany capitulated not because its army was decisively defeated on the battlefield, but because its civilian population was dying en masse. This horrific episode established the foundational blueprint for modern economic warfare. The contemporary tools we recognize, sanctions, blacklists, asset freezes, and trade embargoes, are direct descendants of the 1914 to 1918 British blockade model. Since then, this approach has been deployed hundreds of times, resulting in the deaths of millions of civilians, whilst almost invariably failing to achieve its stated policy objectives. Yet, it persists because it serves other, often unacknowledged, purposes: domestic political posturing, the pursuit of profit, and, crucially, the maintenance of global empire. It is critical to understand that you, as an individual, cannot simply escape the ramifications of this system. When entire countries are subjected to sanctions, you ultimately bear the burden of higher prices for goods and services. When national reserves are frozen, your own currency inevitably weakens, eroding purchasing power. And when global trade networks become fragmented, your living costs inexorably rise. The system of economic warfare, forged in the crucible of World War I, is the very framework that governs your daily life today. And it is now accelerating towards a profound, structural collapse. The United States is weaponizing the dollar with such aggressive frequency that the international community is actively constructing viable alternatives. To prepare for a future where economic warfare is commonplace and sanctions inevitably fragment global markets into distinct blocks, individuals and entities should consider the following practical steps. 1. Diversify your currency exposure. Avoid exclusive reliance on the US dollar. Instead, consider holding a portion of your assets in other major currencies such as euros, or even the Chinese yuan where feasible, alongside traditional safe havens like gold and, increasingly, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. As sanctions accelerate de-dollarization, a diversified portfolio of currencies will significantly mitigate your financial risk. 2. Prepare for persistently higher costs. Sanctions are inherently disruptive to global supply chains, meaning essential goods like food, energy, and manufactured products will inevitably become more expensive. It is prudent to build substantial savings, actively reduce debt, and prepare for an environment of sustained inflation. 3. Recognize the inevitable fragmentation into economic blocks. The ongoing weaponization of finance will lead to the emergence of distinct spheres: a Western bloc comprising the US, Europe, and their allies, an Eastern bloc encompassing nations like China, Russia, and Iran, and the Global South, which will strategically navigate relations with both. This necessitates preparing to operate within a world characterized by parallel and often competing economic systems. 4. Understand that the tools of economic warfare will eventually be applied domestically. If governments possess the power to freeze Russian assets or blacklist foreign companies, it is a small, perilous step to apply similar measures against domestic political opponents. We saw a chilling example of this in Canada in 2022, where the bank accounts of trucker convoy protesters were frozen. The very mechanisms designed for international conflict risk being turned inward, a development for which preparation is paramount. Each instance where the U.S. weaponizes its currency, through actions like freezing foreign reserves or severing access to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, provides an undeniable impetus for other nations to develop alternative frameworks. And indeed, they are actively doing so. For example, China has established the CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, as an alternative to SWIFT, while Russia has developed its own equivalent, the SBFES, system for transfer of financial messages. Furthermore, the BRICS nations are collaborating on the development of a shared currency, signaling a clear move away from dollar dependency. Increasingly, international trade transactions are being settled in diverse currencies such as the Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, and even cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, further eroding the dollar's monopoly. Thus, the very sanctions intended to uphold American financial supremacy are, in a profound twist, hastening the transition towards a truly multipolar global financial architecture. Projections suggest that by 2030, the US dollar may no longer hold its unchallenged status as the world's primary reserve currency. Should this occur, the United States will inevitably forfeit its capacity to weaponize finance, relinquishing its formidable sanctioning power and, ultimately, dissolving the economic foundations of its global empire. This represents the devastating long-term consequence of employing economic warfare. While it may yield tactical advantages in the short run, it fundamentally erodes one's own underlying strength and stability over time. A stark historical parallel can be drawn with Britain, which, despite winning World War I through an effective naval blockade, effectively bankrupted itself in the process, leading to the dissolution of its empire within 3 decades. The U.S., it appears, is currently treading a remarkably similar path. Comprehensive sanctions have consistently failed to achieve policy goals in numerous instances. Cuba, after 60-plus years of sanctions, still has its government in place. North Korea, after 70-plus years, remains unchanged. Iran, after 40-plus years, persists. Venezuela, after 7-plus years, is still led by the same government. Russia, after more than 10 years of escalating sanctions, continues its course. The success rate, objectively speaking, is alarmingly close to 0. So why, then, do powerful nations continue to employ them? There are, primarily, 3 compelling reasons. First, domestic politics. Sanctions allow politicians to project an image of toughness and decisiveness without incurring the immense political cost of war. They can declare, "We are doing something impactful," without the controversial necessity of sending soldiers to die. This resonates favorably with voters. Second, economic warfare inherently benefits certain actors. For instance, U.S. liquefied natural gas, LNG, companies reap significant profits when Russian gas is sanctioned, as Europe is then compelled to purchase more expensive American alternatives. Similarly, U.S. defense contractors often benefit financially when sanctions regimes escalate into outright military conflict. There are undeniable profit motives at play. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, sanctions serve as a crucial tool for empire maintenance. They effectively communicate a stark message to the rest of the world. If you do not adhere to our established rules, we will cut you off from the global economy. This reinforces and perpetuates the US-led financial order. This central objective is to safeguard the dollar's preeminence and the United States' overarching control of global financial mechanisms. Yet, a fundamental paradox emerges. Far from preserving this dominance, these very sanctions are ironically accelerating the decline of the dollar-centric global financial order. Yet, the government remains firmly in place, still actively developing nuclear weapons. The sanctions demonstrably failed in their strategic objective, but the population paid an unimaginable price. In Venezuela, as previously mentioned, there are an estimated 40,000 plus excess deaths directly attributable to U.S. sanctions. This figure comes from a comprehensive 2019 study by economists Jeffrey Sachs and Marquise Broad, detailing the horrific consequences of medicine shortages, food shortages, and the widespread economic collapse. The sanctions were ostensibly designed to target the government, but ultimately killed civilians. The Maduro government, however, remains in power. Iran's sanctions regime has caused severe medicine shortages that have tragically killed thousands. Cancer patients struggle to access life-saving chemotherapy, and diabetics cannot obtain essential insulin. The sanctions make it virtually impossible to import pharmaceuticals. People die while the nuclear program, again, continues. And finally, consider Yemen. The Saudi-led blockade, heavily supported by the U.S., has precipitated what the United Nations describes as the worst humanitarian crisis on Earth. Over 400,000 people have died from starvation and disease. Not from bombs, but from the relentless blockade. Just like World War I. The pattern, stark and tragic, is always the same. Sanctions kill civilians, governments invariably survive, and the stated policy goals are often left unachieved. Yet, the death toll is real, and it is massive. So, this begs a fundamental question. If sanctions so rarely work, what is their actual purpose? Officially, sanctions are intended to pressure governments into changing their policies by making the economic cost of non-compliance unbearable. In practice, however, they almost never achieve their stated objectives. This long-term weakening of the dollar directly contributes to an increased cost of living for you. Fourth mechanism, sanctions are ultimately paid for by taxpayers. When the U.S. sanctions a country, it frequently provides financial assistance or other forms of aid to allied nations that are adversely affected by those very sanctions. For instance, when Russia was sanctioned and European energy costs skyrocketed, the U.S. provided liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe at heavily subsidized rates. Who ultimately paid for that subsidy? U.S. taxpayers. When sanctions diminish the global food supply, the U.S. often provides food aid to affected countries. Who pays for that? U.S. taxpayers. In essence, you are funding these sanctions through your taxes and then paying for them again through higher prices for goods and services. It's a double extraction. Now, let me reveal the horrifying death toll from modern sanctions, because this represents a hidden, massive cost that almost no one discusses. While the World War I blockade killed 800,000 Germans, modern sanctions have, regrettably, claimed far more lives. Consider Iraq. The UN sanctions imposed on Iraq from 1990 to 2003 are estimated to have caused 500,000 excess deaths, the vast majority of whom were children. UNICEF tragically reported that child mortality rates doubled during the sanctions period. Essential medicines, food, and water treatment chemicals were all systematically blocked. Children died from diseases that were entirely preventable. Critically, these sanctions did not succeed in removing Saddam Hussein from power. The 2003 invasion eventually did. The sanctions merely killed 500,000 people. Moving to North Korea. Sanctions imposed since the 1950s have undeniably contributed to periodic, devastating famines. The famine of the 1990s alone is estimated to have killed between 600,000 and 1 million people. Sanctions severely impeded the import of vital food and fertilizer. People starved. Reduced supply invariably translates to higher prices, and you, the consumer, ultimately bear that cost. Second mechanism, fragmented global markets and reduced efficiency. Before the widespread imposition of sanctions, companies enjoyed the flexibility to source materials from anywhere in the world, optimizing their supply chains globally to minimize costs. Now, companies are compelled to meticulously avoid sanctioned countries. They cannot procure materials from Russia, Iran, Venezuela, or other restricted nations. This forces them to utilize more expensive, alternative sources. Those increased costs are then inevitably passed on to you, the end consumer. For example, prior to 2022, European manufacturers relied on cheap Russian gas. After the sanctions, they were forced to purchase significantly more expensive American LNG. Production costs tripled for many industries. These inflated costs are then passed on to consumers as higher prices for cars, home appliances, and virtually everything manufactured in Europe. You pay. Third mechanism, sanctions create inflation through currency effects. When the U.S. takes the unprecedented step of freezing a country's dollar reserves, it sends a powerful and unsettling signal to every other nation globally. Dollar reserves are no longer entirely safe. In response, countries begin to diversify their holdings, moving away from the dollar and investing in gold, the Chinese yuan, or other alternative currencies. This diversification reduces the global demand for dollars. When the demand for dollars falls, the dollar's value inevitably declines. And when the dollar weakens, the prices of imported goods rise significantly. You, in turn, pay more for everything imported: food, electronics, clothing, cars. The sanctions on Russia, particularly the freezing of $300 billion in reserves, dramatically accelerated the global trend of de-dollarization. Venezuela's economy collapsed by an astonishing 75%. Hyperinflation utterly destroyed the national currency. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, and a 2019 study by economists Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot estimated that over 40,000 Venezuelans died from sanctions-related causes. Despite this immense human toll, the Maduro government remains resolutely in power. The sanctions failed in their objective, but the population paid a terrible price, just as the World War I blockade killed 800,000 Germans while the Kaiser remained safely in power. The pattern, tragically, always repeats itself. Sanctions target governments, but ultimately kill civilians. Now, I want to explain why you, personally, cannot escape this insidious system, because most people mistakenly believe that sanctions exclusively affect only the targeted countries. That assumption is profoundly incorrect. When the U.S. sanctions a country, it directly impacts you, even if you have never set foot in that sanctioned nation. Here's the intricate mechanism at play. First mechanism, disruption of global markets. When Russia was cut off from SWIFT and sanctioned in 2022, global energy markets were immediately thrown into turmoil. Russia produces 10% of the world's oil and 17% of its natural gas. Sanctions significantly reduced this supply. Consequently, prices spiked globally. You paid $5, $6, even $7 per gallon for petrol, not because of domestic U.S. supply issues, but because sanctions reduced the overall global supply. When Iran was sanctioned and its oil exports were severely curtailed, global oil supply decreased, prices rose, and you paid more at the pump. Similarly, when Venezuela was sanctioned and its oil production collapsed, supply decreased, prices rose, and you again paid more. Every sanctions regime, without fail, reduces the global supply of something, be it oil, gas, metals, grain, or fertilizer. Its currency, the rial, lost a staggering 80% of its value. Inflation spiked to over 40% and unemployment soared. Critically, severe medicine shortages emerged, tragically leading to the deaths of thousands of Iranian citizens. The Iranian people suffered immensely. Yet, the government's nuclear program, the stated target of the sanctions, continued apace. The sanctions, therefore, demonstrably failed to achieve their primary policy goal, but succeeded in devastating the civilian population, much like the World War I blockade. Next, let's examine Russia. In 2014, following Russia's annexation of Crimea, the US and EU imposed an initial round of sanctions. They severed some Russian banks from Western finance, prohibited technology exports, and froze the assets of certain Russian oligarchs. These sanctions were then massively expanded in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They largely cut Russia off from SWIFT, seized an unprecedented $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, and prohibited virtually all forms of trade. The immediate result was an initial contraction of Russia's economy, but it swiftly adapted. Russia now trades extensively with China, India, and the global south. Intriguingly, these sanctions have arguably hurt Europe more than Russia, with European energy costs spiraling by 400% and German industry beginning to deindustrialize. Yet, the Russian government remains firmly in power, still prosecuting the war. The sanctions have failed strategically, but they have undoubtedly succeeded in fragmenting the global economy, echoing the disruptive effects of World War I. Finally, consider Venezuela. The United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Venezuela starting in 2017, explicitly aimed at pressuring the Maduro government to change its policies. They froze Venezuelan assets, prohibited oil sales to the U.S., and blacklisted numerous Venezuelan officials. The outcome? In the 1970s, there was the infamous oil embargo against countries perceived as supporting Israel. The 1980s saw sanctions imposed on South Africa in protest of its apartheid regime. In the 1990s, comprehensive sanctions were enacted against Iraq following the Gulf War. And then came the modern era, characterized by sprawling, comprehensive sanctions regimes against Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, and dozens of other countries. The process, strikingly, follows a distinct, almost ritualistic six-step pattern. 1. Step 1 *, identify the target country. Step 2 *, sever their access to international banking by imposing SWIFT restrictions. Step 3 *, prohibit companies from engaging in trade with entities listed on the sanctions list. Step 4 *, freeze assets held by the targeted nation or its affiliates in Western banks. Step 5 *, prohibit the provision of insurance and shipping services. Step 6 *, patiently await the inevitable collapse of the target economy and the suffering of its population until the government is forced to change its policy. It is, in every precise detail, the 1918 playbook, resurrected and applied to the 21st century. Exactly. Let me now illustrate how this mechanism functions today with specific, contemporary examples, because the underlying pattern remains strikingly identical in every instance. Consider Iran. In 2012, the United States and the European Union imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran in response to its contentious nuclear program. They systematically cut Iranian banks off from the SWIFT system, rendering international transactions almost impossible. They prohibited oil exports, which constituted Iran's primary source of national revenue. Billions in Iranian assets held in Western banks were frozen, and hundreds of Iranian companies and individuals were blacklisted. The result? Iran's economy contracted by an estimated 20%. They valiantly fought for another 18 months, but the ultimate outcome was now inevitable. And by November 1918, with its population starving, its economy on the brink of collapse, and its military utterly exhausted, Germany finally surrendered. Now, allow me to draw a direct and unambiguous line from the economic warfare of World War I to the sanctions regimes of today. The intricate system that was meticulously crafted and implemented between 1914 and 1918 is, quite simply, the very system we find ourselves living inside today. Following World War I, the great powers of the world came to a chilling realization. Economic warfare was, in many respects, a more effective instrument than conventional military warfare. It was cheaper to execute, carried significantly less risk of direct confrontation, and could achieve strategic objectives without incurring the immense political and human cost of sending soldiers to die on battlefields. Consequently, they began the process of institutionalizing it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the nascent League of Nations made several attempts to employ economic sanctions. For instance, when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions on Italy. While these particular sanctions ultimately failed, largely because they were not comprehensive and Italy's major trading partners refused to participate, the attempt itself established a crucial precedent. Economic sanctions were now formally recognized as a legitimate tool of international policy. After the cataclysm of World War II, the newly formed United Nations was granted the power to impose economic sanctions under Chapter 7 of its charter. The United States and its allies subsequently began to deploy economic sanctions as a primary instrument of foreign policy. We saw this during the Korean War, with UN sanctions levied against North Korea. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Eastern European nations. If Britain was blockading Germany and starving its civilians, then Germany would blockade Britain and sink its civilian-carrying ships. The grave problem, however, was that sinking civilian merchant ships without warning constituted a clear violation of existing international law. Submarines were conventionally expected to surface, issue a warning to the targeted vessel, allow passengers and crew ample time to evacuate safely, and only then proceed to sink the ship. But this protocol was utterly impractical for submarines in a combat scenario. If they surfaced, they became highly vulnerable to attack. Consequently, Germany adopted the controversial policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, sink on sight, no warning given. This audacious strategy very nearly succeeded. At its peak in 1917, German U-boats were sinking an astonishing average of over 600,000 tons of shipping per month. Britain was, by all accounts, mere weeks away from running out of essential food supplies. However, unrestricted submarine warfare carried a catastrophic side effect. It ultimately drew America into the war. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat controversially sank the RMS Lusitania, a British passenger liner. A staggering 1,198 people perished, including 128 American citizens. The American public was understandably outraged, and President Wilson issued stern warnings to Germany. Germany, keen to avoid America's entry into the war, temporarily paused its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. But in 1917, driven by a desperate need to break the crippling British blockade, Germany fatefully resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. American entry sealed Germany's fate. American industry, American food production, and vast American credit all now solidly supported Britain and France. The war, effectively, was over. Germany simply didn't realize it yet. Britain cleverly framed the blacklist as a series of private commercial decisions, even though the choices were undeniably mandated by the government. This legal fiction afforded Britain a degree of plausible deniability. This pivotal moment marks the true origin of modern sanctions architecture. The audacious idea that you can weaponize finance and trade by creating official lists of prohibited entities and systematically cutting them off from the global economic system. The United States employs this very mechanism today with its OFAC sanctions list, and the European Union does likewise with its own sanctions regimes. It is unequivocally the 1918 British blacklist, merely enhanced with computers and sophisticated databases. Now, allow me to illustrate how Germany attempted to counter this suffocating blockade, because their desperate response ultimately created the second, equally destructive half of modern economic warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany was acutely aware that it was being economically strangled, and it possessed one formidable weapon that could potentially threaten Britain in a similar manner: its submarines or U-boats. Britain, as an island nation, imported massive quantities of food and raw materials. The British Isles simply could not domestically feed their burgeoning population. They were critically dependent on imports from distant lands like America, Canada, and Argentina. Germany reasoned that if it could sink enough merchant ships bringing these vital supplies to Britain, it could, in turn, starve Britain just as Britain was starving Germany. In February 1915, Germany formally declared the waters surrounding Britain a designated war zone and announced its intention to sink merchant ships within this zone without any prior warning, using its submarines. This was a direct and desperate retaliatory measure against the British blockade. British banks were prohibited from extending credit or loans, and British insurance companies were barred from insuring your ships or cargo. In essence, you were entirely severed from the British financial system. And given Britain's pervasive control over most of global finance, being blacklisted effectively meant you were cut off from the global economy altogether. The blacklist was enforced with an unyielding ruthlessness. If you were, for example, a neutral shipping company found to be carrying cargo destined for Germany, Britain would swiftly place you on the blacklist. Once blacklisted, you found it impossible to obtain insurance for your ships from British insurers. And since British insurers held a near monopoly over the global maritime insurance market, this effectively meant you couldn't insure your ships at all. No insurance, no shipping. Britain also exerted immense pressure on neutral countries to comply with the blockade's dictates. They delivered a clear message to nations like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands. If you continue to trade with Germany, we will sever your access to vital British coal, British credit, and British shipping services. Most neutral countries, heavily reliant on British trade, reluctantly complied, as their dependence on Britain far outweighed their economic ties to Germany. This insidious system effectively created a state where Germany was utterly financially isolated. Even when they possessed gold to pay for goods, they simply couldn't buy anything internationally because no one would sell to them. No ships, no credit, no insurance. Complete and suffocating isolation. And here lies the sheer genius of this strategy. It was technically legal. While international law explicitly prohibited military blockades of neutral ports, there was no existing law against a private entity refusing to do business with another. Britain maintained it for another 8 grueling months, until Germany was finally compelled to sign the punitive Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. During those 8 months of ostensible peace, an estimated 100,000 more Germans tragically starved to death. Why? Because Britain ruthlessly employed the blockade as an instrument of leverage. The ultimatum was stark: sign the treaty, accepting all our stringent terms, or we will continue to starve your population. Germany, having no other recourse, ultimately signed. The final, horrifying death toll from the blockade, approximately 800,000 German civilians, the vast majority of whom were women, children, and the elderly, as the men were largely in the army, receiving military rations. This was not merely collateral damage. This was the very essence of the strategy, to starve the civilian population and thereby break the nation's will to continue fighting. Now, let me illuminate the crucial financial dimension of this blockade, because the naval blockade itself was only one half of Britain's comprehensive economic warfare strategy. The other equally potent half was financial isolation. Before World War I, the global economy operated predominantly on the gold standard, with the British pound serving as the world's reserve currency. London reigned supreme as the undisputed financial center of the world. Consequently, the vast majority of international trade was financed through British banks and denominated in British pounds. When the war erupted, Britain ruthlessly weaponized this inherent financial dominance. They established a mechanism known as the statutory list, more commonly referred to as the blacklist. This was a comprehensive roster of companies and individuals located in neutral countries who were suspected of engaging in trade with Germany. If your name or company appeared on this blacklist, British companies were expressly forbidden from conducting any business with you. Germany desperately attempted to synthesize nitrates domestically, utilizing the groundbreaking Haber-Bosch process, which extracts nitrogen directly from the air. While this technology proved successful for manufacturing explosives, thus keeping the war machine running, they simply could not produce enough for both explosives and fertilizer. Faced with an impossible choice, they prioritized explosives. This was the terrible dilemma imposed by the blockade: feed the army or feed the population. Germany chose the army, and its civilians began to starve. By 1916, food shortages had become acutely severe. By 1917, they had escalated to a catastrophic level. The winter of 1916 to 1917 is still remembered in Germany as the infamous turnip winter, a grim period when turnips, normally reserved for animal feed, became the primary food source for millions of Germans. Bread was rationed to a mere 170 grams per day, roughly 6 ounces. Meat was virtually non-existent, while butter, milk, and eggs completely vanished from civilian markets. People were forced to consume dreadful substitutes, coffee brewed from acorns, sausages made from sawdust, and a truly awful bread concocted from ground chestnuts and potato flour. The resulting malnutrition was devastating. Children's growth was stunted, infant mortality rates spiked alarmingly, and common diseases that would normally be mild became deadly because malnourished bodies simply lacked the strength to fight them off. By 1918, hospitals across Germany were filled with children succumbing to starvation-related illnesses. And the horror of the blockade did not cease when the war formally ended. This is a chilling detail that most people remain unaware of. When Germany signed the armistice on November 11, 1918, signaling the cessation of fighting, the British blockade, astonishingly, continued. Britain starkly declared that anything capable of sustaining Germany's economy was considered contraband, including, most controversially, food itself. Blocking food shipments to civilian populations was, technically, a direct violation of international law. The Declaration of London, signed in 1909, explicitly stated that food could not be blocked. Yet, Britain brazenly disregarded this. Their justification was rooted in the concept of total war, arguing that in such a conflict, there existed no meaningful distinction between military and civilian spheres. If German civilians were adequately fed, they could work in factories producing weapons. If German farms received sufficient fertilizer, they could grow food to nourish soldiers. Ergo, everything sustained the war effort, and therefore, everything must be blocked. This audacious interpretation marked the true birth of total economic warfare, the chilling idea that civilian populations are legitimate targets because their existence and labor implicitly support the military. And it worked with devastating efficacy. By 1915, Germany was already facing severe food shortages. Before the war, Germany had imported approximately 25% of its food, grains, meat, fats, and oils. The British blockade completely cut off these vital supplies. Initially, Germany attempted to compensate by drastically increasing domestic production. They planted more crops, introduced stringent food rationing, and rigorously organized their entire economy around the principle of self-sufficiency. However, these measures proved woefully insufficient. The core problem was fertilizer. Modern industrial agriculture, upon which Germany depended, requires vast quantities of nitrogen fertilizer. And nitrogen fertilizer was manufactured from nitrates, which Germany primarily imported from Chile. The blockade completely severed this crucial supply line. Without sufficient fertilizer, crop yields plummeted by an astonishing 30 to 50%. This chilling declaration marked the genesis of the hunger blockade, the economic weapon that would ultimately claim the lives of 800,000 German civilians. Naval blockades themselves were certainly not a novelty. Navies had been imposing blockades on enemy ports for centuries. However, the sheer scale and comprehensive nature of Britain's actions were utterly unprecedented. They didn't merely restrict military goods. They blocked absolutely everything. Food, medicine, vital fertilizers, raw materials, essentially everything Germany needed to sustain both its military machine and its civilian population was systematically interdicted. The blockade's effectiveness hinged on a remarkably simple mechanism: geography. Germany had severely limited access to the open ocean. The North Sea constituted its sole viable route to the Atlantic. And Britain, through its strategically located bases in Scotland and England, controlled the North Sea entirely. Every single ship attempting to reach Germany was compelled to navigate through narrow channels, which were constantly patrolled, 24/7, by British warships. If you happened to be a neutral merchant ship, perhaps from Norway, Denmark, or the Netherlands, and you intended to trade with Germany, you had no choice but to pass through British-controlled waters. And Britain would invariably stop you. They would board your vessel, meticulously inspect your cargo, and if you were found to be carrying anything on their rapidly expanding contraband list, they would unhesitatingly seize it. Initially, this contraband list featured obvious military items, weapons, ammunition, explosives, and military equipment. However, with ruthless efficiency, the list systematically expanded to encompass almost everything imaginable. By 1915, it included food, fertilizer, metals, chemicals, rubber, cotton, wool, leather, literally everything. It was a brutal contest of resources, industrial capacity, and access to vital global markets. Britain ultimately triumphed in that war, not primarily in the muddy trenches of France, but in the sophisticated financial centers of London and across the crucial shipping lanes of the Atlantic. Early in the conflict, there was an initial belief that quick mobilization and decisive battles would lead to a swift victory for one side. However, by December 1914, it became starkly clear that neither side had achieved such a victory. The Western Front had solidified into a nightmarish stalemate of trench warfare, with millions of men dug deep into the mud from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea. Both belligerents quickly grasped a grim reality. This war would not be won by ingenious tactics or sheer bravery alone. It would be won by whichever side could sustain the immense demands of industrial warfare for the longest duration. Whoever possessed more steel, more oil, more food, and critically, more credit, would ultimately prevail. And in this grueling contest, Britain possessed a colossal advantage that Germany lacked: the Royal Navy. Britain commanded the largest navy in the world, boasting over 300 major warships, granting them absolute control over the seas surrounding Europe. Germany's navy, while powerful in its own right, was significantly smaller and effectively confined to the North Sea. Britain's overwhelming naval superiority meant it could enforce a total blockade with devastating efficacy. Indeed, on November 2nd, 1914, just 3 months after the war ignited, Britain formally declared the entire North Sea a military area. They announced that any ship attempting to enter or leave German ports would be intercepted, meticulously searched, and seized if found to be carrying anything deemed useful to Germany's war effort. The system of economic warfare, forged in the crucible of World War I, has not only evolved, but has become the paramount weapon of modern conflict. And you, whether you realize it or not, are inextricably trapped within its intricate web. When the United States imposes sanctions on a country, your access to global markets inevitably shifts. When SWIFT disconnects a nation, the prices you pay for goods and services change. When trade wars escalate, your cost of living spikes dramatically. The very system conceived to starve Germany 107 years ago is the identical mechanism that now dictates whether you can afford your groceries, fill your car with petrol, or secure adequate housing today. Over the next 25 minutes, I intend to meticulously unpack how Britain weaponized the global economy during World War I, how this economic blockade resulted in more German deaths than combat itself, and how it forged the template for modern sanctions, sanctions that have, in turn, claimed millions of lives across the globe. Crucially, I will demonstrate why you are utterly unable to escape this pervasive system. Every single international transaction you conduct flows through an infrastructure explicitly designed for economic warfare. Understanding this isn't merely an academic exercise in history. It is the origin story of the financial control system you currently inhabit, a system where money serves as a weapon, trade becomes a brutal battlefield, and civilian populations are, tragically, the primary targets. Let me begin by shedding light on what World War I truly encompassed, because much of what you were taught in school is, at best, incomplete. You were educated that World War I revolved around trench warfare, the horror of poison gas, the deadly efficiency of machine guns, and dramatic military battles. While not entirely incorrect, this narrative is profoundly incomplete. The real war, the one that ultimately determined the outcome, was fundamentally economic. In November 1918, Germany finally surrendered. What's often overlooked is that the German army had not been decisively defeated on the battlefield itself. In fact, German troops still occupied parts of France and Belgium. While their spring offensive had faltered, the military structure remained largely intact, capable of continuing the fight for many more months or even years. So, the crucial question arises, why did they surrender? The answer lies in a devastating toll. 800,000 German civilians had starved to death. This wasn't due to bombs or bullets, but rather a relentless British naval blockade. This blockade effectively severed Germany's access to global trade, systematically starving its population into submission. It marked a watershed moment in modern history, as it was the first time a major power was vanquished, not primarily by military might, but through economic warfare. Britain waged this war with a potent arsenal of financial instruments, trade embargoes, blacklists, and, of course, the naval blockade. They ingeniously transformed the entire global economy into a weapon. This very strategy laid the groundwork, becoming the definitive blueprint for every economic sanctions regime we see today. Consider the SWIFT banking system, which can isolate countries from international finance, that is, in essence, the 1918 British financial blacklist, simply updated with modern computers. Similarly, the sanctions currently imposed on nations like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea are merely the 1918 blockade, now administered with paperwork instead of warships. These maximum pressure campaigns, designed to starve civilian populations to compel government change, are a direct echo of what Britain inflicted upon Germany, a policy that claimed 800,000 lives, predominantly women, children, and the elderly. And here's why this historical context is profoundly relevant to you right now in 2025. This grim reality underscores a profound loss of individual agency, as the very systems once designed to foster prosperity are ruthlessly repurposed to exert control and inflict strategic harm, leaving little room for maneuver or genuine escape from its pervasive influence.